need to remind you that Jim Crow law is on the way. Black life does matter. And if you need some interpretation, send it to Nirma. Don't send anything to me. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, our theme from Kansas Avenue is greater than, the theme for 2022. Greater than. The supporting texts are Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And then from the Master himself, Matthew 19:26, with man this is impossible, but with God, say it with me, all things are possible. The title of today's presentation from the good doctor next to me is, Who Do Men Say You Are? Or I would personalize it, say that I am. And that comes from Matthew 16:13. You can find it there. Yes, in his book, Hello Healthy, Dr. Wes Youngberg make a statement. Listen to this. He says, you and I are the one in charge of our personal health. Your personal physician can't do it for you. No one can do it except you. End of quote. And you can find that in Hello Healthy, page 9. Ladies and gentlemen, pray with me for guidance. Our Father and our God, we come to you today with praises on our lips, thanking you for this life that you have blessed us with the people that you have given knowledge and understanding, education, and you have called them and they are committed. Such person, one of them is next to me. I pray for Dr. Columbus Batiste that you will give him recall, energy, and as he shares with us, that we'll sense your power working through him, and your name only will be glorified. In Jesus' name, let everyone with me say amen. This program is sponsored by the Kansas Seventh-day Adventist Church and its awesome pastors, and produced by the Health Ministry Department under the able leadership of Nirma Usher and her extraordinary team. Now, I'm going to slow it down just a little bit. I want to read this biography regarding Dr. Batiste. I noticed he didn't put a lot of stuff in it. Maybe I put some stuff in there that he doesn't want in there. But here we go. Dr. Batiste is a board-certified interventional cardiologist and assistant clinical professor at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine. From 2008 to 2020, he served as chief cardiology. Oh boy, look at you. For once, I'm not a judge reading anybody's sentence to death or jail. I'm reading about a black man at his finest. Dr. Batiste currently serves as the regional medical director of home-based cardiac rehab, and he chairs the regional cardiac quality committee for Southern California Permanent Medical Group. Over the years, Dr. Batiste has received or recognized for his work and community abroad by multiple organizations. I can just imagine that. In 2010, Dr. Batiste sought to break the cycle of prescription and procedure as the sole management of chronic disease, and began promoting a long-term solution for his patient through, listen to this, nutrition, stress reduction, exercise. As a result, in 2011, Dr. Batiste established an integrative cardiovascular disease program based at Kaiser Permanente. This program sought to prevent the reoccurrence of major adverse cardiac events in patients who are diagnosed with cardiovascular disease by focusing on lifestyle modification. There is more. 2016, Dr. Batiste led a group that collaborated with Samsung Technologies and developed a virtual cardiac rehabilitation program utilizing Samsung wearable. Since its launch, the program, listen to this number, which applies the principle of lifestyle, has treated nearly 10,000 patients. Awesome to that. Dr. Batiste's mission, all right, that's a possession, is to share information so each one, teach one about the benefits of plant-based nutrition, daily exercise, stress reduction, and therefore provide everyone, all right, with the opportunity to take control of their health, understanding that the health of an individual is uniquely tied to their community. Dr. Batiste collaborated with the formation of a nonprofit organization called Healthy Heart Nation. The mission of Healthy Heart Nation is to improve the health of the community by narrowing the disparities in, listen to this, education, business, justice, and ultimately, health, otherwise described as social determinants of health. Doc, welcome home. I'm going to just ask you 2 questions and then we'll let you go. All right, here we go. Number 1, this is one of the questions you and I. Why African Americans are prone to poor health? And number 2, why are African Americans dying at an alarming high rate? I'll see you on the other side of your presentation. Good luck.
All right, sir. Thank you. All right, good afternoon, good evening, where you're at. It's a pleasure to be here again. I'll tell you, it's always good being home, and it's good to speak with you today about an important subject. You know, one of the things I always say when I start off giving a talk, and I remember, Pastor Jenkins, I remember one of these times, several years ago, I gave a talk and you said, I love hearing how doctors interpret the Bible, put their spin on the Bible. You know, it kind of reminds me back with Walter Pearson, you know, that he used to make the statement that doctors are always trying to be preachers and preachers are trying to be doctors.
Yes.
Basketball players are trying to be rappers and rappers are trying to be basketball players.
There you go.
Is what we know. So I don't know where I fit inside of that, but today I just want to present to you just a little subject matter, slightly different. And I'll tell you, there's a term I love to use, and it's called wonderment. Wonderment. Seeing the unfamiliar in the familiar. And so oftentimes I'll talk about, you know, when I was a kid watching a TV show, whether or not it was the Cosby Show or the Brady Bunch, I watched it from the perspective of the kids. But as I'm older, I watch it from the perspective of the parents. Bringing it home to a church body, when I was a kid, I listened to the story of David, and I thought of the sling as a toy. But as I've grown and I've learned, I realized that it was a deadly missile, that it was powerful, that was there and what was there. And so today I want to present to you a different angle to things. And so bear with me as we get going here, and we'll advance these slides here. And title of today's talk is, Who Do Men Say That You Are? And I'm going to go ahead and have the gentleman up top there, the fine professionals, go ahead and advance the slides for me as we get going on this. But as we dig into this idea of who do men say that we are, I'm now on slide 3, Matthew 16, verse 13. It says, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets, right? But what about you? He asked, who do you say that I am? So when we get into this, now slide 4, it says, but who do you say that I am? Think about that for a second, folks. This is almost, now I apologize for the analogy, it's almost like if Michael Jordan, they said they were comparing Michael Jordan to Nick Van Exel. Now, Nick Van Exel was a good basketball player. He was in the NBA, but he was no Michael Jordan. It's almost like if you compare Dak Prescott to Roger Staubach or to Tom Brady. He's a good quarterback, but he's not quite at that same level when we look at deity. And so who do men say that you are is my question as we move forward in the slides. And if you were to go to Google, and years ago, some of you may remember this, if you were to type into Google, who are you? You put in black youth. Who would society say that you are? Who would society say that you are? As we advance through, let's take a look at who society says that you are when you put in 3 black teens. Is this who you are? Is this all that you're comprised of? As we move forward and we look, what about when you say 3 white teens? What populates the imagery inside of Google as we advance the slides forward? What populates that when we see the difference and disparity between the perception that's there as we advance the slides forward? Additionally, if you were to say, well, let's see unprofessional hairstyles. Come on now. What's going to show up unprofessional hairstyles? Is it going to be the way you look, or is it the way someone else looks? As we begin this process, I'm going to have you stay there for a moment as I'll catch up to you. And so when Google was faced with this, Google said this. They said, this is fundamentally a societal problem. There are persistent and problematic biases, and they're quite pervasive in the media, on the web, etc. Let's pause for one moment here. right? And so what they described is they said search engines in turn reflect what's on the web. So what is perceived is based on the perceptions of individuals around that are feeling this here. And as we advance forward, now what's so interesting, let's go forward a slide. Oh, thank you, sir. Now, how many of you guys have been engaged in technology out there? How many of you guys have been loving the stress with technology? Come on now, all right? This is what happens. So we have to be thankful for when technology works and you have professionals who can get things going there for you.
Amen.
But I'm going to tell you, there's a wonderful book out there called Caste, written by Isabel Wilkerson. And what she says, and here's a quote, it says, "What is caste?" According to Wilkerson, caste is the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of doubt, human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. That's powerful when you begin the process of looking at that. And so this follows up on the work of David Williams out of Harvard, where he developed what's called the everyday discrimination scale, because many out there say, you know what, doc, no, that's not my story. I'm fine. I never experienced anything like that. But he developed this scale that says, are you frequently treated with less courtesy than others? Are you treated with less respect? Are you provided poor service? Do you ever encounter a situation where people think you're not as smart based on the way you look? Do people somehow grab their purse or shudder away from you because they're afraid of you? They believe you're dishonest based on initial impression. Or they act as if they're somehow better than you. We see this all the day, every day, every single time as we look forward, and we know just here recently what happened. We saw that Walmart actually said what? They said they must pay a black man $4.4 million in racial profiling when he just went in to buy a light bulb for his refrigerator.
I love it.
But was accused. And so I ask you today, who do men say that you are? Who do men say that you are? Well, you say, well, that's them, Doc. That's the average person. If I'm a man of standing, that's not going to happen to me. Well, what about Oscar-winning actor Forrest Whitaker?
Yeah.
Right? He decided to go into a grocery store and was accused of being a shoplifter and was subsequently frisked in public by an employee at a local store near Columbia University. I ask you today, who do men say that you are? You say, Doc, he's just an actor. He's not a professional. He's not educated. He's just an actor. But what about the President of the United States? What about, we remember when on the tarmac, the Arizona governor, Jan Brewer, she infamously wagged her finger at then President Barack Obama.
Bite it off.
Or how about South Carolina representative yelled out, "You lie," during a speech at the joint sessions of Congress. I ask you today, who do men say that you are? Now you say, well, wait a minute, that's the president, I get it. He's going to be faced with so much. But I draw your attention to what about now Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown? That when we began the process of looking at her qualifications, we looked at her qualifications compared to every other justice. We saw that she exceeded the qualifications far and above everyone else. But that did not stop what we saw. We saw that still her qualifications were questioned. That despite being an undergrad at Harvard, despite being the Harvard Law Reviewer, that still it came into question saying, I want to see her scores. I want her to prove her value. I want to believe, I want to know, did she exceed her caste? Who do men say that you are? Who do men say that you are is what I want to know today. And so as we go, we say, well, okay, that's them, but I'm going to bring it close to home for me as a doctor. That time when I was standing chatting with the nurses at the nurses station. Another person came up to me and asked me if I knew where such and such was. And I said, sure, I know where such and such is. Let me go and get it for you. And they came back over and asked me, well, can you go and move the trash out of this room? Now, I have no problem moving trash. I move trash every day I come home, right? My wife tells me what to do. There's no problem with that. The issue isn't about moving trash. The issue is the perception of my ceiling, the perception of as high as I can rise inside society that was seen once again with another physician colleague. That this doctor was seen trained at Mass General, a doctor at Mass General that was questioned, her qualifications questioned when she attempted to help someone in the airport. This is not new. This is not new. I want to tell you here today that there is a history of mistreatment and mistrust that extends back generations, that leads to problems, that leads to disparities in care. That's here. I want to take you back in time. In another era, I might have been a history teacher. So forgive me if I put on my education hat for here a moment. I'm not an EDD, I'm not a PhD, I'm an MD, but I'm going to put that on for just a moment. And so when we look at profiling, has its antecedents as early as 160 AD, when Roman physician Galen described African men as having oversized genitalia and being intellectually inferior. Now, don't get too excited or too angry out there. This still is a misrepresentation for some and may be appropriately assigned to others. When we look here additionally, what additionally do we see? We see that he's not the only one. We see too here as well, the 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, who proffered the Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises above trifling. He further asserts that the difference between whites and the African Negro is as great in mental capacities as it is in color. Who do men say that you are? As we begin the process of continuing to look, we see that Samuel George Morton wrote Crania America, or a comparative view of the skulls of various aboriginal nations of the North and South America, in which he claimed that black people had smaller skulls than white people and thus smaller brains. Experts contend this work provided the foundation of scientific racism that began. Who do men say that you are? Who do men say that you are? During and after the American Civil War, African Americans were argued to be different species than white people. Mixed race children were presumed to be prone towards many medical maladies. Now here's the catch of them all, right? And so when we look in 1851, we see that there was a noted physician named Samuel Cartwright. And Samuel Cartwright, he reported to the Medical Association in Louisiana. Louisiana, that's where my people are from. Louisiana, New Orleans. And what he said right there is he said that he developed a word, a malady, to describe slaves who would run away. And he combined two Greek terms, drapetomania, drapetes meaning runaway, and mania meaning madness. He said for anyone to think of running away from enslavement had to be madness. Gave a medical diagnosis that was there, but we can't stop there. We can't stop there. We look at John Harvey Kellogg. How many of you guys have eaten some Frosted Flakes this morning? How many of you guys have eaten your Kellogg cereal? Right. So of Kellogg's fame, of Seventh-day Adventist history, he said the intellectual inferiority of the Negro male to the European males is universally acknowledged. He wrote in 1902, I ask you today, who do men say that you are? Who do men say that you are? Do they say that you're less than human? And so as you begin to look through this, we know that some of the first epidemiologic studies, which means I'm just going to observe what happens, and we have one of the greatest epidemiologic studies here recently with COVID. We said, let's take people across the world, let's isolate you. Let's drive up fear, and let's see what happens from a malady that's there, that's real. Let's see what happens. Let's infuse this with political strife, and let's see what happens that boils out of this. And I'll tell you, I'm going to jump ahead, that what studies have shown is there's been an increase in heart attacks. Studies have shown there's been an increase in what's called stress-induced cardiomyopathy, all as a result of the things that have transpired over the past 3 years. But this study here in particular, the origins of epidemiology linked to the transatlantic slave trade. Why is that? Slave ships and colonial plantation emerged as a new environment, right? Where what they did is they said, let's allow disease to run rampant. Let's leave people chained. Let's see what the amount of food that they have that causes disease and watch. Who do men say that you are, that you're worth or you're not worth? And as we begin to look through the history, we see the beginnings of gynecologic treatment on women that happened on the enslaved, right? The enslaved at this time, without anesthesia, without these things, and forced, developing techniques that are used to this day. You move through and you look at the idea of Mississippi appendectomies. What are those? We've heard of our appendix getting inflamed, but this is where there was a specific and intentional effort to adopt this concept called eugenics that said that people of African descent were inferior. So we were going to stop birthing from happening. So let's do hysterectomies. Let's take out the ovaries and claim that we're taking out the appendix. It didn't stop there. Who do men say that you are? As we begin the process of continuing to look through, we see that experiments were given to children. This gentleman here, as a child, received radiation. They essentially removed his skull and had his brain exposed, that he continued to live. This is what happens to treatment. We think of only one. We think of, yes, we're all aware of Tuskegee. We understand the trials of this that was not very long ago. See, we have to understand, folks, that these traumas were not very long ago. Who do men say that you are? These were, in some instances, overt, and there's also covert occurrences of things. Now, going back to my favorite book in the past, and I apologize. So when I get hung up on a book, I stay there for a while. So I'm gonna tell you this book by Cass with Isabel Wilkerson. Another powerful statement she's made is she said, a caste system programs people into believing that they have no stake in the well-being of those that they've been told are beneath them. Those that have been told they are unworthy or not deserving. So how does this apply? Does it apply to us as docs? Does it apply to us as individuals, as churchgoers, or as people inside society? We see that this happens on a regular basis, and I'll tell you what it's called. It's called implicit bias. It's called implicit bias. When you make a presumption about someone based on their appearance, when you make a presumption about someone based on where they're at, I'm gonna diverge for a second here, okay? So in some venues, they'll say, ouch, preacher, right? So I'm about to step on some toes. So what you see in this caste system is that people will go ahead and they will strive and fight and climb to be a part of the upper class, the caste. That means that they will go ahead and they will evolve themselves from another lower class. So you may have people who travel from a different country who look just like you. They have the same tan. They have the same beautifully curly hair. But all of a sudden they say, no, I'm not like them. I'm not African American. I'm such and such. I'm not there. I'm here. We have to look in the mirror at how we're responding. That they'll say, well, the end of my name has initials behind it. I have MD and PhD and EDD and everything else, so I'm different than they are. I'm in a different caste system than where they're at. Well, let's make it a little bit more personal. That they'll say, well, you know what, I like his bald head. But someone else will say, I don't like that afro. They must not be as good as what I am because they look differently than what I do. This is implicit bias. And we know this, even within the field of cardiologists, it's ubiquitous, including physicians, other healthcare providers. This issue, also called unconscious biases, it affects how you view the world and how you interact with others. So let's break it down even more. We see that pain assessment, treatment recommendations, these false beliefs about differences between blacks and whites. The feeling is that somehow people of African descent, they can tolerate the pain. Let them be. I don't have to give you pain meds. You're just complaining. But to someone else, another group, it might be different. Document it. Another study basically in 2016. Now, I was giving you historical stuff. This technically falls into being historical, right? But we're saying 2016, a survey, it showed that half of white medical students and residents sampled endorsed the beliefs about biological differences between blacks and white patients. That 25% believed that people of African descent had thicker skin. had thicker skin. You're like, okay, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, what they saw as a result of it is they saw that people who endorse this belief, they showed a racial bias in the accuracy and their treatment recommendations. That these things play a role. It's significant. What about the issue, other areas of implicit bias? We see that African Americans are less likely than whites to receive evidence-based care for strokes, heart attacks, myocardial infarctions, or heart failure. I will tell you, as we look through this, a personal story. I took someone near and dear to me to the hospital just after the COVID, just after developing COVID. And so I'll tell you, as a cardiologist, what I know is what studies have shown, it's not what Columbus thinks, it's what Columbus has read and what studies have shown and conveyed, is the fact that COVID basically increases some of the clotting factors. And we have seen an association between pulmonary embolus, we've seen an association with strokes and heart attacks as it relates to developing COVID. So I took this individual who called me and said that they had been on a walk and started having chest discomfort. 50-year-old African-American female. I said, okay, yeah. And they said, well, I went in and took an aspirin. Okay. Light bulb goes off because they never take medications. They're calling me from a dinner where they don't go in because they're concerned about ongoing chest pain. I stop and say, call 911 immediately. I race down the freeway to go meet them to help carry them to the hospital. Long story short, this individual their symptoms were marginalized. They were overlooked. They looked past me as I had on sweatpants, did not have on a physician garb of scrubs or a white coat. They took forever to do a basic EKG. They took forever to go ahead and get blood work done. As an interventional cardiologist, where I know that time is muscle, that time matters, I knew that there was a quality deficit that I was seeing in that moment, that I saw in a disparity in care right before my eyes. I didn't need to see a different example of it. I didn't need to read it inside of a book. I saw it and was powerless. Imagine what individuals who have no capacity, who don't know about the healthcare system, who don't know what you deserve to receive, who don't know the appropriate care, what are they facing in that moment? This is the peril of implicit bias. This is a domino effect of implicit bias that can change generations, right? Because had someone passed away, that impacts generations of individuals that are there. We see this time and time again. These studies have told us that healthcare professionals exhibit the same level of implicit bias as the wider population. We are not deity. We are not God, even though we may act that way sometimes, right? We may act that way. We're not. And I will tell you that when we look at things overall, here's the thing too as well, that not only are we not God, we're petty at times. We see that 2.54% of the times there's the odds of being described with one or more negative descriptors in the history and physical notes of electronic medical records when describing persons of color. So what are the results of this thing, this caste system, this implicit bias? We're seeing that high blood pressure is through the roof is what we see. There's disparities in high blood pressure. We understand that. We've heard it. We understand, too, as well, that as we look through these disparities in care, we spoke about the coronary artery disease and heart attack risk. A recent publication just came out that said that, guess what? Great news. The rates of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure are going to be going down in the near future for Caucasians. That's wonderful. The unfortunate part is, during that same time period, there's an expectation that individuals of color are going to have higher burdens of coronary disease, higher burdens of diabetes, higher burdens of high blood pressure, higher burden of stroke. That's there. This is what the studies are basically telling us. We're seeing this persistence in disparities that exist on a regular basis. We're seeing the same thing with heart failure. More likely to be younger when you die and succumb from heart failure, less likely to receive the treatments that are as ideal. We see the same things when it comes to a regular heartbeat, less likely to receive the blood thinner that you're supposed to receive, more likely to have a stroke is what we see. All these things are persistent and pervasive. I will tell you in the words of James Baldwin, the wonder is not that many are ruined, but that so many have survived. We focus, and I just focus for a portion of today's talk, on the negative aspect. I told you about all the bad stuff. But here's what we need to do. We need to flip the script. We need to change our approach. Let's look at those who did survive. Let's look at my grandmother who lived into her 90s. Let's look at my mother who's in her 80s. Let's look at the young individuals out there in their 80s and vibrant, looking good. What's the secret sauce? What's the secret sauce that leads them to say, I will survive? There's something that's ingrained. There's something that is in the DNA that's there that I'll tell you. And I'll tell you that Scriptures tells us the same thing. Jeremiah 30, verse 17 says, for I will restore health to you, and your wounds I will heal, declares the Lord, because they have called you an outcast. It is Zion for whom no one cares. Right? And then in 1 Corinthians 1:27, it says, instead God chose the things of the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are not wise. They are wise. And he chose the things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. I'm going to tell you there's power, that God's given us power to make changes. He's given us the roadmap, the instructions, the environment, the body of Christ in order to make the changes that can give us the best odds of survival, because guess what? Our health is tied to our resiliency divided by stress. We understand we're going to face life stressors. We understand there's going to be things that are there, but what's our resiliency based in? Where's our anchor? That's what we have to know. How do you respond when stress hits you? Do you go to the room in darkness, turn on the TV, flip on Instagram and TikTok and listen to all the noise go down? What do you do when you get stressed? What do you do when you get stressed? I want to tell you that there's different approaches that we look at. When we're here, you can either have a challenge response or you can have a stress response. Well, what's the difference, Doc? I'm going to tell you, a stress response is your heart rate goes up, the pupils, they change, and the blood starts flowing different ways, and all of a sudden you get stressed. You're preparing for fight or flight. You go into a hole. But that challenge response is what happens when Kobe Bryant gets that ball in the fourth quarter. That challenge response is when Michael Jordan gets that ball. That challenge response is when Dak Prescott gets the ball driving in that fourth quarter. Come on now. They're ready to go for action. They have increased cardiac efficiency. Their vessels dilate instead of constricting. They have favorable emotions. They recognize what's going on in their body as a marker that their body is preparing them for something great, for the challenge ahead. There's a mindset that becomes important that's there. And so when we look at this overall, it says, while these inequities have indeed taken and continue to take a devastating toll, there's also wide heterogeneity, which means that there's a difference inside all. We're not just one people. There's light, there's dark, there's tall, there's short, there's all sorts, all different sizes, shapes, colors, everything else. That's called heterogeneity. And our outcomes are just as heterogeneous, is what this is saying. And it's suggesting that the existence of substantial individual and collective resiliency among African Americans. There is resiliency tied into you. You don't believe me still, I know it. I'm going to tell you that even studies that were done from back in the 1960s, they compared African Americans to Caucasians inside of Georgia, rural Georgia. And you would say, well, of course the heart attack rate was going to be higher in them, and they found just the opposite. That the African Americans had a lower rate of heart attacks back in those times. Why is it? Well, was it community? Was it their resource? Was it tilling the ground? We begin the process of looking through different things. We look at the fact of high blood pressure. It's a major issue. We understand that. I've gotten up here before. I promote the issue. We're under Healthy Heart Nation. We're looking to put a blood pressure machine in every black barbershop across America is what our lofty goal is. To help change the tide of hypertension and disparities that are there. But do we ever stop for a moment and think about, what about the 50% who don't have high blood pressure, but yet are faced with the same issues? What's the secret sauce? What's happening there? You know, when we kind of go down that road, we begin the process of looking, even a study, and this is a tremendous study called the ASK study, that looked at high-risk variants in terms of kidney dysfunction. And what they found is 40% of African Americans who had this gene still did not progress towards kidney failure. Instead of looking at the 60, what about that 40? What about that 40? When we look continually, here's the catch. There was something called the Dallas Heart Study. And so down south, you know, it's called the heart attack belt down there. We know that. That's where cardiologists go to make some money, the heart attack belt. I didn't. I came out here to the Inland Empire. It's about service, right? And so what they did, this study tracking, they saw that there was a group of African Americans in Oasis, Wakanda, that was there that commonly manifests a certain gene, the Y142X and the C679X nonsense PCSK9 LOF variant. Now what that does, I'll break it down. What that does, it makes your bad cholesterol low. It makes it resistant. So much so, the pharmacy companies, they took that to make a drug so we can give it to the general public. This drug, because of the fact there was power that was found in this group of African Americans, that there was resiliency that was hidden inside of their DNA is what was clearly seen at this point in time. And we see resiliency. What is resiliency? It's an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune, or damage. And so what's the greatest representation of this? It's something called the MECA trial. MECA, right? Morehouse and Emory, cardiovascular assessment. Phenomenal trial that's happening there. And what this study is looking to do is they're looking to figure out what is the secret sauce in African Americans. And they're going into communities. And they said, you know what, we're not gonna just look at communities at large. Let's really get in, because we know there's some upper class African Americans inside of Atlanta. I know my wife is from Atlanta, so I know what goes on there, right? You have some really upper class individuals, and you have some who are just making it happen any way that they can. And what they did is they wanted to figure out how many of these people, what was the influence on Life Simple 7? What is Life Simple 7? Well, that's what the American Heart Association promotes and says about smoking cessation and weight loss and eating healthier. You guys have heard me talk about eating healthier once or twice, right? Moving more than sitting, and you all have been sitting. I may have you move in just a second. Blood pressure control and all these different things that were there, and they decided to go ahead and take a look at these individuals. And here's what they found. They found that as they started looking at the at-risk, of course they found, the more wealthier a person was, the better off their health was in general. That was no surprise to anyone. But here's the thing, they started going ahead and normalizing for that. And they averaged out the income, they averaged out all the areas, and what they started seeing is this change in terms of what was predictive of being healthier, using less resources, having less heart attacks, dying less. And all of a sudden, what they're seeing inside this whole general scheme here is they tested them. They said, what do you mean by neighborhood health? Well, it looks pretty, that I can walk where I want to go, that it's fairly safe, there's less violence, that I can get into activities with my neighbors, I have access to healthy food, there's no food insecurities, and that there's social cohesion that's there, right? And so as they began looking through these things in particular, what they saw is what was significant, I'll tell you. When it looked beautiful, no surprise. My son was driving today. Yes, driving. 15 years old. Took him out driving in the morning. Talk about stress going up a little high. My stress went a little high in that moment. But driving down the road there, and he said, Dad, I love driving down streets like this. They're so pretty. I said, you know why? I said, because you see all the trees out there. You see the sun beaming. You see the skies are blue like that. And so when you have this aesthetic quality, people feel better. That we see too as well that when you have the safety score was high, when you have food access that's high, all these things were predictive. But here's the catch. When they really honed in, they said social cohesion and activity with neighbors. Social cohesion, coming to church, ouch, to myself, right? Social cohesion, coming in and coming together. And also what? Activity with your neighbors, not just sitting here in isolation, but getting out there what the folks out there are doing. They said, we want to be a part of the community. We want to engage the community. That these were the things that built up characteristics of health, of well-being, is what they began to see at that time. And so, well, what else did they see? They saw that besides the social cohesion, it resulted in lower blood sugar, their cholesterol levels were lower. It showed that too as well, that overall their smoking likelihood was lower when they began getting involved inside these aspects. It's powerful. When they got engaged with activities with their neighbors, same thing. They saw the same sort of phenomenon take place there too as well. Powerful indictment really about the power of getting out of isolation, breaking the chains of isolation. All across the board, all these metrics show the benefit. And so here's the key. You can look individually, but here's the thing. We know that we're stronger together. That when we come together, there's more power. So this is what it showed, that individuals, even if your resiliency as an individual was low, if you're part of a community, If you're part of the community, if you're part of that church body, that all of a sudden, guess what? You're lifted up as a result of being a part. There's power that's there, and studies are starting to bear this out in clear distinction, is what we're seeing on a regular basis. And so as we continue to go through, we see too as well. Now, as a cardiologist, I measure something called arterial stiffness. So I'm gonna get a little nerdy with you right now, okay? So imagine your arteries of your body, they're kind of like garden hoses. So imagine if they're baking inside the desert. What's going to happen to that rubber hose? It's gonna get stiff, isn't it? That means when you go and step on it, it's not gonna really compress. But we see in general, if the more it rebounds, and it can compress and expand, the healthier it is, which is predictive of all ailments. And so they measured this, and what did they find? Lo and behold, they found that activity with neighbors, social cohesion, they found that purpose-filled life was associated with improved arterial resiliency. That stiffness was improved with it. I want to tell you today, church, that your health is tied to resiliency divided by stress. I've told you before, some of you were with me before when I said this, you gotta get selfish. You have to get selfish is what you have to get. I wanna tell you that selfish, if you don't remember, selfish, the S stands for spiritual, right? It means you need to take time for mindfulness, for meditation, for prayer. The E stands for exercise, and I don't mean CrossFit, I don't mean Peloton. Come on, Tunde, if you're out there watching with us right now, we'll get together tomorrow, but you can just walk. That's all you have to do. The L stands for love. Love. But here's the thing, love, how many of you out there are married or been married ever in your life? Now, anyone out there who's been married ever in your life, you know that love is not a noun, it's a verb. It takes work, just ask my wife. It takes action. It requires forgiveness. It requires gratitude. It requires all these things. And here's the thing, studies have shown a benefit to your arteries, a benefit to your blood pressure, a benefit to your cardiovascular health when you take time to take that action into work. The food, the F stands the F is for food, real food, whole food. We'll talk about that in a moment. The I for intimacy, we just spoke about that. Not in a sexual way, but in a way in which it's coming together as a group that you can relate to someone almost like David and Jonathan did in the Bible, right? That you have a friend that you can call on. That's there. That's what the intimacy, the I in intimacy stands for. The S stands for sleep. How many of you slept more than 2 hours last night? Raise your hands and keep them up. 4 hours, keep your hands up. 6 hours, keep your hands up. Oh, this is a healthy group right here. This is a healthy group. More than 7 hours is what you're shooting for, right? Sleep is the hidden secret sauce that's there. And what does that H stand for? Laughter, humor, joy of life is what that stands for. That joy that radiates and emanates from you is what you have to embrace, and studies have also shown a power that's there. And so when we look at the food, yes, it's the food. It's always been the food. You all know me. It's the food. Come on, Pastor McBride. It's the food. We know studies have shown what? It's shown, just a recent study out of the Veterans Administration showed what? It showed that when looking at African Americans compared to Caucasians, right? Going back to the beginning, is there a difference? That when you begin to feed as real food, whole food, plant-rich food, all of a sudden your outcomes begin to improve. That all of a sudden your risk of dying goes down exponentially. And that's what we see on a regular basis is we see the African-American toll drops exponentially to the left of the screen compared to the right of the screen. That when we look at specific disease states as well, we begin that process of seeing overall for all the major diseases. If you move away from eating foods that have 4 legs, that walk, that crawl, that have a mother. If you start eating foods of the earth, what begins to happen is all of a sudden everything starts to become reinvigorated. We start to see what? That you return to Wakanda. That all of a sudden you realize that there's power that's there on a regular basis. And so there's power that we see combined in our food. When we look closer, there's a study called regards. And you may not have any regards for this type of study. But this study has regards for you, and it's going to give you information because when you looked at the Southern dietary pattern, I don't know if any of you have family from the South or from the South. You know that there's some organ meats that are fried up. You know that there's some sweet tea that's there. I'm sorry, I mean sugar with a little bit of tea mixed inside of it, right? And so when we start to see these things that's there, we see, what do we see all of a sudden? The green line demarcates eating real food, whole food, and your likelihood of having heart disease compared to the red line, which is eating the Southern-style foods, is markedly different. Your survival rate's higher. Your risk of having a heart attack is a lot less when you begin to adopt foods from the earth. Now, let me take a step back, because what my grandmother ate from New Orleans, where my mom was born at Charity Hospital, and I was too ignorant to understand Charity Hospital must mean it's the county hospital. It's charity. That what we saw in that particular moment is we saw that she ate greens, red beans and rice, because she couldn't afford all the other foods and the meats and everything else like that. And so what studies have shown is not only that, we see your risk of heart failure, which means your heart's either too stiff or it's too weak, goes down exponentially based on your dietary patterns. That your risk of dying suddenly goes down exponentially based upon the foods that you eat. That your risk of what? Of kidney failure and dialysis goes down exponentially based upon the foods that you eat. Your risk of stroke goes down exponentially based on the foods you eat. That as we grow more mature in years lived, somehow the slide deck went, so I'm gonna have you folks go ahead and adjust that for me. That as you begin to mature, right, all of a sudden we find that your memory cognitively remains sharp and intact. Part of the foods that you eat, the activity, thank you very much, the foods that you eat and the things that you do on a regular basis is what we see there in stemming the tide of things like Alzheimer's disease. There's power in these choices. Pausing for a moment, because this is important. Show of hands, how many of you all who are of working age or were of working age put money aside for retirement? Had to. How many of you all who raised your hand could have used that money when you were taking it out? Yeah, all right, thank you. That's real right there. But guess what? You put that money and left it there. Why? Because you wanted to live life a particular way when you retired. You wanted to maintain a certain type of lifestyle. You wanted to enjoy certain things. And so I want to pretend to you today that when you make choices in whether to move or to sit, and what you eat, you're investing in your future in the same way. You're saying, I want to live life a certain way in 5, 10, 20 years. What do you want? What do you want? What are you willing to do to get what you want? What won't you do to get what you want? Other studies, the Adventist Health Study basically showed the same thing, that as we begin moving from eating any and everything, irrespective of race, that all of a sudden the weight, the pounds begin to shed, right? I'm not talking about eating the food that can survive a nuclear holocaust, that stays on your shelf and doesn't even change its appearance, that all that bacteria won't even eat it. That I'm saying that when you begin moving from eating any and everything towards a plant-rich diet, diabetes begins to go away and dissipate. That as you begin the process of moving from eating any and everything towards a plant-rich diet, high blood pressure begins to dissipate. We see this, your cholesterol begins to dissipate. It leads us to say one thing: who are you? Whose are you? Are you taking care of your body as if you belong to someone? How are you taking care of your body? There's power in your choices, is what I'm trying to tell you. Don't believe the hype. Don't believe it that you're less than. Don't believe it that you're not worthy. Don't believe it that you're a lower caste. Don't believe it at all. I want to tell you, who are you? Who are you? You're enough. You're worthy. You're resilient. You're strong. You're loved. You're powerful. You have the capacity at your hands. That's what I want to tell you here today. That's there. That when we begin this process here, we have to look at, you're not who others say you are. You're who God says that you are. What's my dream? I know I can't change everybody. I know I can't change the world, but I see a world. How many of you guys have heard of blue zones? The most long-lived individuals in the world, the Wakandas of the world. Well, I want to see black blue zones is what I want to see. I want to see black blue zones. I want to see brown blue zones. I want to see yellow blue zones. I want to see blue zones where we can live our life to fulfillment and live a life of purpose. That's the reason for getting selfish. It's not so you can go and keep doing the things you were doing before. It's so you can live a life of purpose and the fulfillment. Now, I always show this video when I give these talks, and here's the reason why. This is an example of black blue zone. down in Alabama, where you had celebrating marriage of a 90-plus-year-olds with joy in their hearts. At this time, back at that point, it was Dr. Ernest Rogers, 93 at that time, and Mrs. Annelle Wright, age 91, united in marriage at Oakwood University SDA Church in 2009. And guess what? Dr. Wright, you say, well, why would they get married at 93? There's nothing that, that's too late in life. Well, Dr. Rogers went on to live 12 years later, and his wife, the newlywed, is still alive. There's power in your choices. There's power in your choices. So I don't know if this is going to play. To have and to hold, to love and to hold. You may embrace your life. So I'll tell you, I'm not trying to get remarried at age 93. I'm trying to renew my vows at 100, all right? My wife says she's not renewing the vows at 25 years or anything like that, but at age 100, she is going to promise me, she hasn't said it yet, but I'm going to make her twist her arm, she's going to renew her vows with me at that time, because that's what life is about, living it in fulfillment. And so what I want to tell you is that, when we look in general at this, we look at the rose in the concrete. How many of you guys know what the rose in the concrete represents? All right, the concrete rose tells the story of a rose that grows up from a crack in the concrete, defying the laws of nature. In Shakura's poem, the concrete symbolizes the toughness of the ghetto, and the rose conveys the greatness that can rise from adverse circumstances. I want to tell you that you can. You can arise from the circumstances around you. I want to tell you that you can overcome that high blood pressure, that diabetes. I want to tell you that you can overcome those ailments that are around you, that you can invest in your future today. There's resources that are there. Don't let today pass without taking advantage of what's in front of you. And I'm here to help you. So if you have any questions, I'm here for you. I'm not going to charge you, promise. Now, my wife might charge you, but I'm not going to charge you. I'm not going to charge you, all right? And so here's the thing. If you have questions, go to healthyheartdoc.org. Check me out on social media. I'm learning how to do this stuff. I didn't know how to do this stuff. Self-promote or send you over to a website or do social media. I'm learning, right? There's plenty of gray in these eyelashes that are here, It's just you may not be able to see them. So thank you for spending time with me this afternoon, and I look forward to connecting with you going forward in the future and making the best you that you can be.
We have a number of questions. Pastor, do we have time for the questions? All right. The chat says, the first one, here it is, Doc. It says, implicit bias is here to stay. And then she asks you a question. Can you see it there? What can we do to get around it, especially if it relates to health care?
Yeah. What I would say as it relates to, thank you. I promise I am better in the cath lab doing procedures than turning on the mic. Trust me inside there. I can manipulate the wires, okay? Don't get scared just because it took me a second or two, promise. All right, now here's the thing. Yes, you're right, implicit bias will always exist, but we have to persist in our efforts to break these barriers and to break this cycle, this vicious cycle. It requires education. It requires you being an advocate for your own health. That's the key. So when you go to doctor's offices, you have to treat this like a date. You have to understand that we work for you, that we're your advisors. If we're not advising you well, guess what you do? You keep it moving. You see the next person that's there. You have to advocate for your own health and make sure that someone communicates with you. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. It just means they weren't right for you.
Next question. By the way, is your wife here?
She is.
Oh, okay, I just want to make sure. The next question is from Maria Torné. She says, why does men resist going to the doctor or doing something to change their health status? You know who Maria Torné is?
I think so, yes.
All right, go ahead.
All right, so you're right. We do. And here's the thing, it's not pervasive, it's not just limited. Big part of it is, I think it's fear that drives us. Fear that keeps us away of the unknown. That someone is telling, we're vulnerable in that moment. And we're hostage to a provider telling us what we have to do, or the fear that we're going to somehow not be able to provide. That our manhood may be taken away, that somehow we're going to have a disease that we're scared of from knowing full knowledge of what happened in our family or friends or others. And so we have to, number one, educate. We have to be persistent and vigilant. For you as friends, spouses, sisters, aunties, mothers, stay on that dude. Keep them going. I know I have an appointment I know I'm supposed to go get myself. I'll tell the family, I said, I saw the doctor today. I looked at him in the mirror. And they're like, nah, that's not good enough. You need to go in and go be seen.
Hey, there's another one. Why African American prone to poor health?
Well, I think we just saw it, right? The question is, are African Americans prone towards poor health, or are there social determinants that impact us, that our response innately ends up leading to disease? So when we understand that race is a social construct, we understand that. Science has really delineated that irrefutably, that genetically we are the same. There's more variability between Chinese individuals than there are between African Americans and Chinese. That we understand this, but we understand that if race is a social construct and racism is a social construct, we know that disease and disparities is a social construct as a result of poor housing, as a result of poor education, as a result of pollutants, poor sleep, because now the housing lives near highways where there's noise and pollution and so forth, leading to asthma that may perhaps lead to an impact in ability to go through schooling without being out. That all of a sudden now the lack of education leads to a lack of job. That now we have this vicious cycle that begins at a lack of insurance, a lack of access to health-promoting foods. When we look at food insecurities, it's not just an issue of saying is someone plant-based or not, it's are we giving you the bottom of the barrel? Are you having foods in the food desert that are filled with fast food companies and restaurants and quick service that's all around you, that's discounted and subsidized, that leads to this? Is it an issue of African Americans, or is it an issue of society? I pretend it's an issue of society. I pretend that just like the movie, yes, I watch movies, Trading Places with Eddie Murphy, when they decided to swap Eddie Murphy with Dan Aykroyd, yes, they saw all of a sudden their outcomes shifted. Things changed completely.
Look at this one. Why are African Americans dying at an alarming rate? Is the same thing?
Yeah, so we're going to see combination of all those things, plus we look at access. I think access to health care, we look at the combination now that I discuss of implicit bias. So if now when I finally present, because I present later, and because of the lack of insurance, I use the ER services in urgent care, and now if there's implicit bias that's there too as well, the quality of my care is not as high. And so what we have to look at is we look at what are we doing as a healthcare system. When I look at individuals who may be no-show, my question is, are they no-showing because they don't care about their health, or is it because I have banker's hours and they have to work and can't get off? We have to really look at our system, the way in which we're delivering care, and begin to ask the right questions. And I don't know that we're asking the right questions to solve the healthcare crisis in America.
Two more questions. One is, you say your wife was here, right?
I'm focused on you right now, sir. I'm not looking into the audience, so I can't comment about that.
Follow up to that question, A, is how do I get around her to get to you for free?
So yeah, she's fine. She's fine. She says, hey, she's about service. So the wife is about service and about making sure that we take care of our community. That's the key important thing, is what she is about. And as leader of Healthy Heart Nation, that is her mantra, is to go ahead and to make sure that as a community we can drive change.
Last question. Any question from the audience? Any question? Yes.
It's a great question, very insightful question. So I'll start with the latter first, which essentially is asking, is there the same level of disparities or the same impact when you look at individuals from, yes, I'm gonna repeat the question. So that's what I was getting to, I was more explaining it. So we're looking at, when we look at Africans, do they experience the same issues in terms of health and outcomes as African Americans? And essentially what we find studies, actually there's been studies on this, what we find is that the levels of high blood pressure are markedly lower in people, in Africans, than they are in African Americans. And here's the thing, in Caucasians of America, right? So we know that as you begin to move from West Africa through the Caribbean to the United States, the trajectory of high blood pressure and ailments rises exponentially. But here's what we're seeing more so around the world, globally, in Africa as well, is we're seeing this capitalism. We're seeing this transition of the Western American diet, that this attainment of success is being like the Americans and eating like the Americans, and that's driving up the burden of ischemic heart disease, heart attacks and heart failure and things of that nature in Africa and many other countries around the world where historically that has not been the case. Now, to respond to the first question, and I'm more summarizing it than verbatim, is really the issue of how do we delineate or differentiate, or is the impact the same as it relates to what I'm going to characterize as microaggressions compared to the issues of implicit bias? And I would pretend they're one and the same. And so I think David Williams has really shown that out of Harvard, and he called that everyday discrimination scale, and that's what I touched on, these microaggressions. So having a seat at the table, I ask you, do I really have a seat at the table? Do I? Do we? So is there really truly the same level of the ultimate decision making? The ultimate decision making, or or is there a ceiling that's still there? A recent study just came out, or was reflected on, I came across actually just today from UCLA, looking at the amount of African American or Black physicians. It has not changed in centuries, decades. It's the same. The peril that's there, we look at, in accordance to the percentage of the population, we're around 5% compared to a population of 13, 14, 15%. We have not shifted. And part of that is a role that's there in decision-making that plays a role in who's getting accepted, who's not, the types of questions, the testing. There's so many factors that come into play that's there. I'll say this as a last example because it's a practical one. So I did serve as chief of cardiology, and during that time, I would hire individuals. All right. And I'll tell you, I hired people who I couldn't carry their bags in terms of their academic performance. I had colleagues who told me, Columbus, listen, I don't think you would hire me the way that you are on people bringing them in. But here's the point of all that. God opened that door for me to do that, right? It wasn't mankind or anything else of that sort. But the key is that I had a conversation with another surgeon and trying to explain the idea of affirmative action to him. And I told him, what happens, Dr. Such and Such, if you tell me you have a friend who has a son who's a cardiologist? What do you think is going to happen? I'm going to say, I know how good of a guy you are. Let me bring him in. And the chances are I'm going to hire that person unless there's a major red flag. How many of us have those connections to get in the door like that? So the idea of having the opportunity or exposure, not less qualifications, we want the same. We're not saying come bring us in, we're unqualified, but we're saying have the qualifications and being it. When you look at the perspective from a standpoint of leadership, if you say, this is my ideal of a leader, remember I showed you the Google slide. What do you type in? In your own mind, close your eyes, and if you were to say, think of a doctor, am I what you envision? If you say the executive, a CEO of a company, am I what you would see? Or is it someone else? That's what we're faced with.
Heavy. That's heavy. We got to go home on that. Doc, thank you. We're over our time. Thank you, Pastor, for doing this, okay? Say that again?
Oh, yes, thank you. Social media, Facebook, Healthy Heart Doc, Instagram, Healthy Heart Doc. For those of you who hadn't seen it, I do a joint podcast, video podcast with Dr. Eric Walsh on YouTube, Slave Food Project on YouTube as well.
Who moderate that one?
It's my wife, Danette Batiste.
I just want to make sure. Take us home. Pray for us.
Bow your heads. Dear kind Heavenly Father, we thank you for your many blessings, your mercies. We thank you for your word that you've given us in Scripture and in health. I ask, Lord, that you would help us to come together as a community, not just to help ourselves, but to help others, to find purpose in living and be reflective examples of a Christian spirit that you would instill inside of us. Thank you. Take us all home safely. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Doc. Adios. That was awesome.